We're continuing on in Journey Through the Bible, and I'm quite fortunate. I'm teaching this week and next week, but luckily it divides into two really good pieces. So up until now, remember, we've gone through the Exodus, and Moses has died, and so they're on the precipice of finally getting all the promises that God's given to Abram and Isaac and Jacob. And God's basically said to them, you have to go and conquer the promised land, or the land of the Canaanites. So that's where we start. Here we go. Good, works. All right, so remember, they were stuck in the desert for 40 years. Why 40 years? Because they disobeyed God, and all of those generations had to first die out before they could enter the promised land. Before they go into the promised land, what happens? Moses sends out 2 spies. He sent out Joshua, he sent out Caleb. And he sent 10 other spies. Only 2 came back and said, things are fine, we can conquer. The other 10 said, look, no, it looks bad. Everyone there's big and strong. We're never going to win. And so that's one of the reasons God cursed Israel. They didn't trust in him. So the book of Joshua is very much like the book of Exodus. You'll see a lot of these themes repeat, a lot of the tales repeat themselves, almost in sequence. And even the leader Joshua, which means Jehovah saves, which is what Jesus Christ means, is a picture of Christ. So Moses was the leader. He then gave over this role to Joshua, because Joshua was a faithful leader, a godly man, one of the few men in Israel who was going to go into the promised land. The other guy who went into promised land was Caleb. And later that becomes important when we see God keeps his promises. Okay, so the period of time we're going into now is about 400 years long. So we're going to go from where we were before, which is the Exodus, now into the Promised Land. The time period I'm going to cover is going to be about 7 years today. And then there's about 393 years that follow in the books of Ruth and Judges. I'll talk about that next week, but this week we're just going to follow the 7 years where they conquered the land. So as I said, Moses dies. God comes to Joshua in Joshua 1 verse 6 and 7 and 9 and says to him, be strong and courageous. Did God ever give that promise, or did God ever ask Moses to do the same? Yes. But Moses wasn't very strong. So what did he say? I can't go out to the Egyptians. I can't speak to the Egyptians. I need some help. And so God sent Aaron. So as you follow through in the book of Judges, like I said, try and think back at the Exodus, because a lot of the pictures in the book of Judges very much parallels what happened in the Exodus. So, God made it clear that his people would inherit the promised land. He promises to Abram in Genesis 15, verse 18 to 21. This was later confirmed by Isaac in Genesis 26, verse 3, then Jacob, Genesis 28, verse 13, and then Moses, Deuteronomy 34, verse 4. So, there is this picture the whole time of you have to go back and claim the land that I've given you. Where does this all come from? It comes from Genesis 3, verse 17 to 19. Cursed is the ground because of you, in pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. So out of Genesis 3, verse 17 to 19, you see there's a curse on the land. So part of what God does and God promises is he's going to break the curse. How does he break the curse? He gives Canaan, or the promised land, back to his promised nation. The book of Joshua is then divided into 4 parts. The first 5 chapters is entering the land. 6 to 12 is conquering the land. The next chapters up to chapter 21 is when they divide the land into certain areas. And finally, it ends in these last 3 chapters, 22 to 24, where Joshua tells the nation what God expects. What he expects as a leader, how he lived as a leader, and what he wants from his nation if they are to prosper. Okay, so entering the land. I've divided that part into 5 things that happen in chapter 1 to chapter 5. So Joshua enters the land and he does the same thing that Moses did, which is he sends out spies. But this time he's smarter. He doesn't send out 12 spies, he just sends 2 spies. What does he do with the 2 spies? He says, go and check out the land, see what the land is like. They do that, and because of their proximity to Jericho, that's the first city they get to, which is a really big, powerful city. What made Jericho so unique? Jericho had a wall, a really tall wall. Does anyone have any idea how tall the wall was? About 13 meters. It's a pretty big wall for those ancient days. And so almost double the height of the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China is about 7.5 meters. So it was a really massive wall. And what does he do? He sends in these 2 spies. Spies get into the city and they find this woman called Rahab. Rahab was a heathen prostitute. They go and hide out in a house. Interesting thing happens. Rahab says, wow, I've heard all these things your God's done before you got here. I want to help you guys out because I fear your God. She then hides them in her house. Right? The house is right on one of the walls, one of the mud walls. She puts them in the roof, in the flax. She sort of puts like these roof mats over them and they hide there. The king of Jericho hears this and then he says, look, I'm going to send some soldiers. Let's go and find these 2 guys. He gets to Rahab. Rahab says, guys aren't here. They're left outside the gate. So she sends them a wild goose chase. So these guys run out, go and chase down these 2 spies. The spies are not in Jericho. And in the evening, she tells them, escape. But these spies said, God's going to send us into the land. I don't think they fully understood what God was going to do, but it was very clear that they were going to conquer Jericho. So what does Rahab ask for? She asks for leniency. She trusts God, she trusts God's people, and she says, look, can you guys please not kill me? And interestingly, she doesn't just ask for her life, she asks for the life of her family. That's a very interesting thing to think about, because did her family believe in the God of Israel? No. But later you'd find that even though they didn't believe, they still got saved for the grace of God. So that's the first thing that happens. The spies then get back, and what do? In Joshua 2:24, they say to Joshua, truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. That was very different than in the time of Moses. Like I said, 10 spies came back, they all complained. 2 said, God's going to give us the capacity to conquer. Here, 2 spies go out, they come back, and what do they say? It's going to be easy, guys. We're just going to melt away. God's going to help us wipe these guys out. So it really shows you a very different heart attitude that the people had compared to the days of the Exodus. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the nation was so different? Because the younger generation grew up in these miracles. How did they eat? God gave them manna, quail from heaven for 40 years. I mean, every day they saw God's provision. Every day they saw God's power. So really the nation has a bit of a different heart than the previous generation who were in Egypt had. So an important lesson this is to understand. Also, the book of Joshua shows you in many ways where the Israelites failed in the Exodus. Here, they don't fail. Here, they start off really good. And importantly, start off really good. Because when we get to Judges, all falls apart again. All right. So, he sends out the 2 spies. Rahab protects the spies. And then, what's the next thing that happens? They cross the Jordan. Joshua 3 verse 15. Now, the Bible spends quite a bit of time explaining what it looked like when they got to the Jordan. So this time of the year when they got to the Jordan, it was overflowing. So it wasn't like it was a little trickle, it was dry, and they crossed it because there was no water in it. It actually takes the time to tell you that the riverbanks were overflowing when they got there. What does God do? Well, God goes to a little city called Adam, 15 miles upriver, and he just stops the water there. He heaps it all up. All right? The river then does what? Dries out. And Israel is supposed to cross this river. To cross the river, they have to take the Ark of the Covenant. So the Levites go first with the Ark of the Covenant. They walk through on dry land. And the Bible takes a lot of time to explain this principle of walking on dry land to actually show you it's a miracle. All right? This wasn't just, a trickle. They climbed over the small little droplets of water and walked through. It was a massive river that was overflowing, dammed up. They walked through. They get to the other side, and then God says, look, you guys have done what I wanted you to. Joshua, tell the people, the 12 tribe leaders, to go and put these big stones. And they put 12 stones on top of each other as a sign that God got them from the Exodus into the new land, into the promised land. And then straight after that, what does God do? The river flows back again, and the embankment overflows. So it all happens at the same day. So clearly, a miracle happens. They crossed the Jordan. What else did the previous happen in Israel? They went through the Dead Sea. So again, a picture in a picture. They get to the other side, and then what do? Circumcision. All right? New nation, new country. What does God do? He starts with Show me your heart. Remember, circumcision was a sign that the males of that nation belonged to God. And so he says, circumcise all the males, and then what's the next thing they do? They have Passover. He makes them remember again the book of Exodus. And then a very interesting thing happens. The angel of the Lord appears to Joshua. That is in chapter 5. So when you get there, Joshua has a surprising encounter with the commander of the Lord's army. So initially when you read it, you just think it's an angel. He walks up to this being and he asks him something interesting. He says, are you for us or are you for our adversaries? So he wasn't sure who this angel or angelic being was for. Are you friend? Are you foe? What's very interesting is the answer. This being says to him, no. I'm not for you or for the enemy. He just says no. I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. Joshua realizes this, and what does he do next? He worships this angel. Right? So is this angel just a normal angel? No, clearly not. It must have been the pre-incarnate Christ, because the angel didn't stop him and say, hey, no, don't worship me, worship God. He accepted the worship. Clearly, Joshua speaks to Yeshua. Joshua speaks to Jesus, which is very interesting. And the interesting thing is what Jesus says. Jesus says, I'm not for or against this nation. The question is not whether God's for them, it's whether they are for God. So what God's really saying to them is, guys, are you going to obey me? So he's not also against the Canaanites. That God doesn't have this vendetta. He wants to wipe out all the Canaanites because he doesn't like the Canaanites. Really what it comes down to is, who follows me, I will look after. I am the commander of the armies of God. And so even here, early in the book, you clearly see that it's not just about being the special nation of God, although that plays a role here. It's about, really, are you going to obey me or not obey me? Now, before we talk about conquering of the land, we're going to cover that in chapter 6 to 12. Just a few things that I think should just talk about, and it's this whole concept that often unbelievers have, or they ask us, in regards to the idea of genocide. Now, Christians are not meant to be murdering and killing other nations, but clearly here Israel was wiping out a whole stack of nations. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So the question you have to ask yourself is, why? Why does God allow this? So to start off with, a few principles. So why specifically did God want to wipe out the Canaanites? Well, the one reason is because they were in his promised land. If you look at Leviticus 18, one of the things that God has against the Canaanites is all their sexual sins. And it gives a long list of sexual sins there. But they were really severely perverse. They were into bestiality, incest, and also into homosexuality. And God very strictly and strongly condemns that. And so specifically in Leviticus 18, it talks about the Canaanites following these lifestyles. Also, when you turn to Deuteronomy 12, verse 29 to 31, what did the Canaanites do? They offered their children to gods. So they were into human sacrifices. And God didn't want his nation to have anything to do with this kind of behavior. The second important thing to understand is that, again, often it does say, Joshua went in and killed everyone. That's hyperbole. Why do we know it's hyperbole? Well, when you look at Deuteronomy 7, it talks about how Israel was to intermarry with other nations. Don't intermarry. Now, clearly, if they killed everyone, can you intermarry with a nation if everyone's dead? No, you can't. There's no point even writing that chapter if you wiped everyone out. Later on, you'll see when we go through specifically the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were a heathen Canaanite nation. Did they wipe them out? No. They actually integrated them into Israel. Why? Because they followed the God Yahweh. All right, so they basically decided they were afraid of the nation, afraid of God, and instead of getting killed, what did they do? They integrated into the nation. All right, they actually were slaves initially, but later on they integrated. So the issue is not so much killing all these nations, is which God do you follow? If you follow the true God, you are forgiven and you get incorporated into the nation. If you are a heathen nation, then God doesn't want that idolatry. And that's really what the murdering and killing was about. It wasn't just about genocide and wiping out everyone they could find. And then also very importantly, if you go to Deuteronomy 20, you read there Israel's rules of engagement. So all armies have rules of engagement. You don't just go in and blow up schools and hospitals and things like that. We have that in the first world. Some of the third world countries clearly don't follow those rules, but there is rules of engagement. You try to kill soldiers, not collateral damage. Now, Israel had the same thing. Deuteronomy 20. It talks about when Israel conquers another nation, who can and can't they kill? And really, you kill soldiers. You don't kill kids, you don't kill babies, you don't kill women, etc. And it's clearly written down there. The idea was Israel was to make peace with nations who they could give their guard to. In other words, nations who would follow Yahweh would incorporate and become part. They weren't to kill them. They were trying to make peace with them. Nations who were not willing to do that, who were not in the promised land, they were not to kill and destroy them. Remember, the promised land was their heritage. That's the part of land they were trying to take back from these nations who took it from them. So those three things are really important when you think about these chapters, because although it says very often they killed everyone, they didn't actually do that. There's a few exceptions to that where they did do that, like Jericho, the Amalekites. So there's some places where they wiped them out completely, but that's actually extremely rare. Most of the time they just killed the soldiers. All right, that's the introduction into getting into conquering the land, Joshua 6 to 12. So they start off at the Battle of Jericho. Everyone remembers what happens there. They get there, they walk around Jericho 6 days, 7th day, they go around 6 times, 7th time, they blow the trumpets, everyone yells, the walls come tumbling down. Now, just a bit of interesting information. So that's what the walls were built like. So the bottom part of the wall down here where Israel walked around was 5 meters high. It was made of stone. The top walls, there's a wall there and a wall there. They were about 2 meters wide and 8 meters high, and they were made of mud bricks. Right? That's important. Why? Because it actually does say in the text they walked up the walls. That makes no sense unless you understand when the walls fell down, all those mud walls collapsed down here. It made a rampart, and so they could actually walk up. All these walls fell down except for Rahab's house. So clearly a miracle from God. So it's not just, natural things all happened and then the walls got soggy from all the rain, etc., and then fell over. It was clearly a miracle from God because Rahab's house didn't fall over. Everyone else's house fell over. So they walked all up the walls, they conquered, and here they were meant to do what? Here they were meant to kill everyone and destroy everything except for the gold and the silver. On the precious metals, you can't really destroy them. You can melt them down. What were they supposed to do with all the gold and the silver? They were supposed to put it in God's treasury. Next big battle is the Battle of Ai. Israel attacks Ai, and what happens? They lose. 36 Israelites get killed. And it's a disaster. Joshua is shocked. He doesn't know what's going on. And basically he turns to God, and God says to him, look, the reason this has happened is because there's someone in your camp who disobeyed. You were meant to put all the treasure in my treasury. That didn't happen. Someone took some of the stuff. All right. Joshua then goes into a long spiel about, guys repent, God will forgive, etc., etc. And eventually they catch the guy. Everyone calls him Achan. The correct pronunciation of Achan is Achan. But Achan basically stole stuff. All right. He stole 200 shekels of silver, which is about $1,500 Australian in silver. And I think 0.5 shekels of gold. Anyway, it works out to be about 600 grams of gold, which is worth about $35,000. And a special dress. So that's what he stole. Does anyone know what happened to them? Well, he comes forth, he says, God, forgive me, he repents, and then stoned. All right? So people look at that and go, oh, that's terrible, that's awful. This poor guy repented and got killed. Well, 36 Israelites got killed because he lied. And he didn't come forth and repent. They had to go through this whole spiel throughout the camp until eventually they caught the guy and oh, yeah, now I repent. I'm so sorry. And it wasn't just him who got killed. Who else was killed? His family. Yeah. Why his family? Because clearly when you hide all the stuff away in your tent, someone saw. You don't just walk in there with a big dress on, all this gold or the silver. And it's like, what's happening over there, guys? So oh, no one knows. So they were complicit. They were part of that. Now, in the same way that Rahab in Jericho was saved and her family was saved, same here, the sin this man did destroyed him and his family. Then, what happens next? The Gibeonites arrive. The Gibeonites are very smart. The Canaanites, they fear God. They fear the people of God. They've heard all the things that God's done. What do they then do? They say, look, let's dress like we've been walking for weeks. Let's pretend we're really, really far away and we've come to make peace with Israel. They get to Israel, they go up to Joshua and say, hey, Joshua, Can we make peace with you? And it's almost comical what happens. Joshua sort of looks at them and says, look, are you guys faking it? Or have you really been walking this long? Oh, no, we've been walking this long. What does Joshua do wrong? He doesn't ask God. He says, okay, you guys seem legit. Let's make a pact. We won't destroy you, we won't kill you, etc. Later they find out the Gibeonites is 3 days hike from them. These guys lied to them. But interestingly, they do get incorporated into Israel. And the main reason they do, as you find later in the text, is because they accepted the God of Israel. What did they eventually become? They became gardeners and servants, etc. And down the track, they incorporated into the nation. Very interesting thing happens next. The 5 kings of the Amorites. All right, one of the kings of the Amorites was the king of Jerusalem. They decide they're going to take out the Gibeonites. Why do they want to take out the Gibeonites? Because the Gibeonites have just allied themselves with Israel. And what happens? Israel attacks his 5 kings and God attacks his 5 kings. So remember what happens there? Those are the 2 famous tales where the big hailstones fell out of the sky and killed only the bad guys. So there's these hailstones falling from the sky in between the Israelites, the Gibeonites, and the Amorites, and only Amorites get killed. So clearly it wasn't just a normal hailstorm. Clearly it was from God. The second thing that happens is God brings the sun to stand still. Now there's lots of ways to try and interpret those verses, but most scholars agree what the verses mean is God put the sun into one place for a day. It just didn't move. So you can look at it from, it seemed like the sun wasn't moving, or the warriors were so busy killing, or they killed so many people in such a short time. It seemed like the sun was standing still, etc. But that's not what the verses say. The verses just say God actually put the sun still for one day and wiped a lot of the Amorites with big hailstones. So God protects this nation, which is not Israel. Why? Because they accepted him as their God. So a very important lesson there. And then for the next 7 years, what happens? Joshua wipes out 31 other kings. And so when you get to the last chapters of chapter 12, it actually names them all. You can go and look at their cities if you want to. But it takes 7 years. Did they wipe out everyone? Clearly not. If they wiped out everyone, later on we wouldn't have a book called Judges. They just would be in the promised land, everything would be going hunky-dory and fantastic. That's not what happened. So now we get to dividing the land. These are these 2 maps here. This is just a little map that shows how they sort of spread across the land. They went from the south, across the River Jordan there, and then started in Ai, Jericho, etc., and conquered south, north, and everywhere. So all the other chapters that follows, 13 to 21, talks about how God divided up the nation and the land for the nation. Now, it's one of those genealogy chapters. You read through that. For me, it's extremely boring. I don't get it. It's all this geography stuff. For me, it means nothing. But to the nation of Israel, it's really important. It's a sign the promise happened. It's a bit like, when they go through explaining the ark and the tabernacle. It's all this measurements and size and stuff that you go like, who cares? It's so boring. But to the Israelites, it's really, really important. Why? It shows you it's a real thing, was really there, and to them it was an exciting thing to do. God commanded them to do this thing. Now, they finally get all the promises with regards to the land that was given to Abraham, Isaac, Moses. All right, so the 12 tribes, Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, Issachar, Manasseh, Gad, Ephraim, Dan, Benjamin, Reuben, Simeon, and Judah. And what do you notice? Manasseh's got a big chunk there. Does anyone know why Manasseh's got such a big chunk of land? Does anyone know? I found it very interesting. So, there are actually many tribes. So basically what happened is the previous tribe had no men, and they had 12 women, or 12 daughters. And then they went to Joshua and complained and said, look, we want some land. And they intermarried. And basically everywhere they intermarried, they got the land. So they got this huge chunk of land because it wasn't given to males. It was given to females, which is very interesting. God's not a God that's chauvinistic. Women are also important. So it's very interesting. The woman got the biggest chunk. So Manasseh, because it's just interesting. If you look like little parts, like why is Benjamin so small? Well, because it's very wealthy parts of the world. Jericho, Jerusalem, very, very wealthy areas. Now, importantly, also God, remember, made the promises to Joshua and Caleb. He was going to give them a special, almost like a prize for their faithfulness and the fact that they got through the Exodus. So what happens is, God gives Caleb Hebron, okay, and God also gives gives Joshua Timnath-Serah. So Timnath-Serah is there at the E of Ephraim. He gives him a city there. He rebuilds a city, and Joshua lives there. Hebron is down there. So Caleb lives there. Joshua lives there. Caleb was 85 years old when he got his city. Apparently God kept him as fit and healthy and strong as when he was 40 years old. So he talks about that in the verses. So God miraculously kept him fit and healthy. So he was, for that 7 years, conquering other cities and fighting. All right. Joshua 20, interesting little section. It talks about the cities of refuge. I'm not sure if everyone has read about the cities of refuge. It's just a very interesting thing to read about because it comes from Numbers 35, verse 9 to 34. It talks about cities where if you inadvertently kill someone, you're in a field, someone trips, they fall over on your land, they hit their head and they die. Or all of a sudden, what happens? It is an agrarian culture. Everyone wants to kill you. You killed their little whatever, daughter, son, and everyone wants to get you. So what do? You run to one of these cities. There were 6 cities, both sides of the Jordan, 3 and 3, 1 day from the Jordan. So it's easy enough to get there. You get to these cities, and basically what happened is you were protected. These cities were set up to protect you until you can go through a court of law. If you go through the court of law and you were innocent, you could live in this city until the high priest died. Once the high priest died, you could leave. If, however, you were guilty, you had to pay the price, whatever that might be, depending on whatever the sin was that you did. And so he does talk about these cities as well. Again, showing you that Joshua also obeyed Moses. He kept to all the promises Moses made. So the summary verses of chapter 21 is verse 43 to 45. It says, "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give their fathers. And they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given them all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass." So that's the first 3 sections of the book. Then it ends in chapter 22 to 24 with Joshua heading towards the end of his life. So Joshua sits down like an old father, speaks to his nation like a wise old leader, and he says, these are the things that God wants you to do if you want to survive, be blessed, be powerful, if you want to live with him. Did they at this point in time remove all the nations? No. There were still Philistines, Amalekites, etc. All these little tiny tribes spread throughout. Let's go back. So here you can see, here's the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Arameans, the Hittites. So around them, they're still heathen nations. Now what they were meant to do is they were meant to conquer the area, and then as time goes on, either convert them or conquer them. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, as we see later in the book of Judges. All right, so what does Joshua do? Joshua 22, verse 5. He says, "Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you. To love the Lord your God and to walk in the ways and to keep his commandments and to cling to him and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." So very early on, same as in the Exodus, same as in Deuteronomy, same as Moses said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. Same as Christ said. Joshua says the same thing. Be very careful to observe. And it's very interesting that, again, love is equated with obedience. How do you show God you love him? You obey him. And that's a very simple principle. So, Joshua asked the people to obey the law of Moses, to remember God's goodness, to obey him. And God had been extremely good to them. They started as slaves, they now own a wonderful nation. Don't intermarry with the heathens of Canaan. All right. Did they keep pure there? No, they failed. Reject idols. And here specifically, Joshua actually divides it into 2 groups of idols. He specifically talks about the idols of the Canaanites, but he also talks about the idols of his forefathers. So the idols they used to worship in Egypt, etc. So he talks about 2 different types of idols you shouldn't worship. Basically, don't worship any idols. What happens? People say, yay, hallelujah, amen. We'll do that, okay? And then Joshua dies. He was 110 years old when he died. And in the years of Joshua and the years that the people remembered Joshua and obeyed Joshua, they were blessed. So that generation that basically left the Exodus, was circumcised, went for the Passover. They obeyed, conquered the land, and did all the right things until Joshua died. At that point in time, who ran the nation? So when Moses ran the nation and Joshua ran the nation, were they kings? No, they weren't kings. They were basically theocracies. God chose them. God said, these two men will lead me. And it's interesting who God chose. God chose men who were, yes, and men who were, faithful. God basically chose faithful men who loved him, truly loved him. Because again, when you read what Joshua says, he doesn't say, hey, obey God, he's powerful, scary, he's going to wipe us all out, he's going to destroy everything. He says, obey him, love him, because he's been so good towards us. So clearly these are men who had a living relationship with God. It wasn't just, I do the right thing and God gives me all the goodies. That wasn't what it was about. It was about a living relationship with a living God. They really did love the Lord, their God. And God blessed them. If Israel did obey God, where do you think they would be today? It's probably around the planet. But they didn't. They disobeyed God. So that's really the book of Joshua, which talks about the conquest of the land. And next week we'll talk about the cycles. We're specifically going to talk about the judges and go into that into detail. Which, like I said, it's another 390 years or so where we talk about how Israel failed and then God bails them out when they turn back to God. And then they fail and God bails them out and so it goes forth and forth and forth. But the pattern is very clear. When you obey God and do what he says and you really trust in him, he protects you. He looks after you. So Joshua in that is a picture of Jesus Christ. Christ came to conquer sin. Joshua conquered and gave the promised land. What is our promised land? Our promised land is more than just a land. It's an eternal place in heaven, eternal relationship with God. Just as Joshua was interested in that relationship with God and his people with God, that's really what God wants. He wants a living relationship of obedience. Not just doing the right thing, but also doing it out of a loving heart. And I think that's all I have to say. So I'll